Okay, so good afternoon. I would like to welcome you all to this seminar series organized by the Department of Politics and Economics. My name is Altuğ Yalçıntaş. I am a member of the department and I will chair the session today. Today we have a special guest, Erwin Dekker. Erwin is a historian and a philosopher of economics at Erasmus University Rotterdam. He and I met in 2014, if not earlier, during a symposium on scientific misconduct and research ethics in economics. Well, I'm an admirer of Erwin's work, of course. Recently published a wonderful book with Cambridge University Press on Jan Tinbergen, or Jan Tinbergen, as we pronounce his name in Turkish. Well, Tinbergen is a very important scholar. Of course, he was one of the first Nobel Prize laureates in economics. He significantly contributed to the development of econometrics, business cycles, and applied economics. But Tinbergen was also an important figure for Turkish economists because he contributed to the efforts of the founding of the state planning organization, Devlet Planlama Teşkilatı in Turkey. And this is what Erwin will talk about today. Erwin, before I give you the floor to you, may I please ask you to limit your talk to 20 or 25 minutes? We will then have plenty of time for Q&A. Okay, so floor is yours.
Thank you. You seeing my presentation?
No, we are seeing actually your Blackboard page. Now we see you.
Okay, now you see me. Okay. Yeah, now I have it again. This is better, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Altuğ, so much for the invitation. And before I start, I should say that what I'm about to present could not have happened without three people. So on your side, there was Ali Somel, who I think is a very good historian of this institution, the State Planning Organization himself. He helped me greatly. He also has compiled an excellent bibliography on the period. So he was one help. The other help was that I had on this side was Emre Demirkiran, who was a Turkish a student with Turkish roots in political economy, and he helped me read some of the Turkish sources. Actually, some of it is published in English, and some of it's, of course, in Dutch archives. But he helped me with particularly the sort of oral history that exists of the State Planning Organization, of some of the people who were involved since its founding. And then finally, I had the help of Peter Cornelissen, who was a student of Tinbergen and who lived in Ankara for, I think, 5 years between 1964 and 1969, during which he worked at the State Planning Organization. So he could also tell me all sorts of interesting details about the period and give me a bit of a sense of what they were doing. This paper is part of my book, which Altuğ mentioned, Jan Tinbergen and the Rise of Economic Expertise. Jan Tinbergen is known for various things. He was at the cradle of econometrics, but after the Second World War, he became interested in development economics and did most of his work in development economics. And I wanted in the book something to counterbalance the very neat planning models that Tinbergen presents us. So he had a theory of planning in stages, which especially on paper looks very neat and nice. And I thought, how am I going to say something about this without just repeating all the nice steps? And I thought I have to go to a country in which he worked and see how it sort of functioned on the ground. That I picked Turkey. There were a few other options that would have been possible, but Turkey is the country that he stayed connected to the longest. out of all the countries, he worked quite a number of years in South America in different countries. He spent some time in India, and he worked in Indonesia. Those are the main countries that he worked as a development economist. But in Turkey, it was the longest period. And I think in some sense, although there are planning organizations in other countries, the legacy might also be the most significant. So how did it start for him? Well, around 1950, this notion of development economics started to grow, and the first country to really start doing development economics was India, where Tinbergen was involved from 1954 onwards. There was lots of famous economists were brought in. On the picture here at the bottom, you see, amongst others, Oscar Lange and John Kenneth Galbraith. So really, some of the top economists. There's also Professor Mahalanobis, who was the sort of local Indian planning expert, and then Jan Tinbergen was there also. And the idea was that through.
Erwin, I'm sorry to interrupt,
yeah,
but we cannot see you. We cannot see other slides. So if you can also switch to number 2, 3, and 4, because
you're not
we only
seeing what I.
First one, the opening.
Oh, you're still stuck on the first one. Okay.
Now we can see the third one. Yeah.
Oh, now
Sorry,
you see the third one. Okay.
Yeah.
And now it's gone again?
No, we can see the PowerPoint number 3 now.
Okay. Okay, then I'll stick to this screen, which I imagine is not that big for everyone, but that's then probably better than the screen share. Okay. In any case, around 1960, he first started coming to Turkey. I think he was shortly there in 1959, but in 1960 it really started. So why did it start in 1950? Well, Turkey in the 1950s, as many people in the Zoom room probably know much better than I do, was governed by the Democratic People's Party, headed by Menderes. Turkey was, of course, an early beneficiary of Marshall Aid, and under that Marshall Aid, they sought to liberalize the economy and especially develop the agricultural sector for export. This was very successful in the early 1950s, so there was a genuine economic boom and lots of optimism. But toward the end of the 1950s, this, for various reasons, among other things, of volatility of export prices, this boom stopped, and there was a lot of economic stagnation, inflation, and the West started pushing for foreign expertise. Many different organizations did so. The IMF did so. NATO did so. But Germany was a particularly strong party involved. And Ludwig Erhard visited the country, and he really urged the government of Menderes to accept some foreign expertise. They didn't want to do so, and there was all sorts of political games being played, but finally they accepted Tinbergen. But the moment Tinbergen arrived, they hid him away in order to save face, because to the public they wanted to let them know that they were still in control of economic policy and that they did not accept this foreign economic expertise. So Tinbergen was hidden away in various institutes. He was not giving any of the statistics that were required, and so it looked like it was going nowhere. Then this event happened, about which I must admit I don't know the finer details, and I'm among other things, I'm interested to hear to what extent you feel that this was an internal political affair or whether it was also an international political affair. But in the 1960s, a military coup happened, formally because they were afraid that Turkey would turn into a one-party state ruled by Menderes. And so he was, as you can see in the picture, arrested, and an interim government that was much more favorable to planning took over. Tinbergen had arrived a little bit earlier, and during this period, his assistant Koopman was in the country all the time, and he urged this new interim government to implement central economic planning and to create a state planning organization. And he really urged the military government to do so because he was afraid that the civil government would not be in favor of such top-down planning. So during this period, there was a lot of political turmoil. The military government officially sought to restore the multi-party system, but at the same time, it was clear that it was hoped that İsmet İnönü, sorry for mispronouncing every Turkish name, and his Republican People's Party, I will not even try the party, but would win the election. In the end, they did. So this was the 1961 election, but with a very narrow margin over the Justice Party, which was the new reincarnation of the earlier party headed by Menderes. It was a very turbulent election campaign, among other things, because some public executions of the former politicians or former political leaders took place, and consequently, or subsequently, the Republican People's Party governed in coalition governments, 3 in a row. This meant that, in some sense, they were never quite as strong as they had hoped to be. And this also meant that the new mandate of the state planning organization was constantly sort of part of the political struggle that was going on. Nonetheless, the Devlet Planlama Teşkilatı was written into the constitution, and the first thing that Tinbergen contributed was a kind of institutional design. Now, I think here my story is a little bit different from some histories of planning, is in that I think that this institutional side of Tinbergen's work is really, really important. And so in the paper and the chapter that I have on this subject, I devote quite a bit of time on the different type of institutional organizations. Here I only show the final outcome of this negotiation process. But to put it in the shortest way possible, the politicians wanted to maintain control over the state planning organizations, whereas the state planning organization itself and Tinbergen to a certain degree wanted as much autonomy as possible. The compromise they reached was this High Planning Council, which consisted of 9 members, or officially 8, 4 planners, so the 4 department heads. Here we see 3 departments: the Department of Economic Planning, the Department of Social Planning, and the Department of Coordination. And then there was an undersecretary for planning, which was the head of the state planning organization. These 4 people were in there. And then there were 4 ministers out of the government, and the prime minister had the final vote. So in case that there was a sort of stalemate between the planners and the politicians, then the prime minister could ultimately decide which way to go. Now, why is this institutional aspect so important? Well, in part because I think Tinbergen did precisely the same thing in the Netherlands, and that's also why my draft paper is called Exporting Institutions. This is what Tinbergen had designed in the Netherlands, or had proposed in the Netherlands. And of course, I won't spend too much time on the political situation in the Netherlands, but the important thing to see here in this picture is the General Economic Council in the middle of the picture, which would take economic policy out of the hands of parliament and partly also of government, and would be a sort of technocratic way to govern the economy. Now, technocracy has to be nuanced a little bit, because Tinbergen was quite sensitive to the fact that the different economic interests had to be represented in this new type of economic policy. So it also had corporatist elements, as he even names it, a corporatist economic life. Nonetheless, this General Economic Council would mostly consist of economic experts, which came from a couple of new institutions that he founded in the Netherlands, most famously the so-called Central Planning Bureau, which to this day occupies a central role in Dutch politics, because it evaluates and estimates the effects of proposed policies by the government. So after 1961, they start to work quite quickly on the first 5-year plan. This, of course, one could say is not the very first 5-year plan, because in the 1930s, Atatürk had experimented with industrial planning and had also implemented 5-year plans. But this was the first one that came out of this new institute, and it was completely set up after Tinbergen's model of planning in phases. Now, this planning in phases consisted of 3 phases and later of 4 phases. Later a regional phase was added, but first in the macro phase, a growth rate was chosen. Then based on a capital output ratio, it was determined how much investment funds would be required in order to obtain this growth rate. And they did so quite optimistically in the first 5-year plan, because they believed that they could improve the Turkish economy and especially do much better than in some of the sluggish sectors they wanted to decrease in size. In the sectoral phase, they used an input-output model, and they developed semi-input-output models in order also to overcome statistical deficiencies or the lack of formal data about the Turkish economy. And as a result, even the very first plan, even though it was supposedly a balanced growth model, was strongly aimed at industrial development. This also demonstrates the political tension between the agricultural sector and the industrial and more urban sectors of the Turkish economy. So whereas the regime of the 1950s was mostly aimed at export from the agricultural sector, now it was hoped that the export could come from the newly developed industrial sectors in the cities. Right? This was supplemented with an ad hoc committee of experts, and then there was supposed to, or it was hoped that the Turkish business leaders, such as, for example, organized in a kind of chamber of commerce, would come up with a lot of investment plans, which could then be utilized to realize these growth plans. Now, there was quite a lot of resistance, and the investment phase for this first plan of 1962 did not take place at all. Instead, what resulted was a kind of political struggle over the funds between the different sectors that had nothing to do with planning, but everything to do with economic power. So even during this first plan, although I know that the institution itself is very highly regarded, or has been very highly regarded for a long time, even this first plan, therefore, was sort of subject to a lot of political struggle. And the most famous vivid illustration of this conflict was the resignation of 3 of the 4 leading planners during this first process. It resulted from a conflict between the government and the state planning organization. Now, the state planning organization, I think in this first time around, had quite a lot of young, very idealistic, sometimes also socialist-minded reformers, and they wanted to engage in land reform. They wanted to reform the state economic enterprises. Even though they were socialist, they wanted to make them more market-oriented and more subject to hard constraints, because now they were often loss-making and relatively inefficient enterprises, and they wanted to engage in a tax reform in order to broaden the tax base of the state and also to finance these new investments. Now, all of these major structural reforms were blocked by the government, and that was the real source of the conflict, but ultimately the resignation happened over whether the plan could be executed with a balanced budget or not. And the planners wanted a balanced budget, and instead the government asked for a higher growth rate, and that could not be realized with a balanced budget. So from one perspective, this is mostly a clash between a logic of expertise and a political logic. Right, the goal was to place experts at a distance from the politicians, but this never quite succeeded because of the High Planning Council and because of the effective control that the government still had over approving all of these plans. I think there was also a genuine sense in which there was a struggle ongoing over who controlled the state, so which sectors benefited most. So I think there's a political economy aspect that I cannot fully develop here, but that I do somewhat in the paper. And this clashed with Tinbergen's claim that he was working for the general interest. And even though working for the general interest in Reconstruction Netherlands made some sense, I think here what it would mean to work for the general interest in Turkey was far less developed, because society was still much less homogeneous, and also certain parts were not modern at all. So there were all sorts of deep-seated conflicts and inequalities in the society, that if one claimed that he was working for the general interest, it was a very different sort of context than he dealt with in the Netherlands. Okay, what the resignation also showed was that there was a big tension on the international level. So before the planners started, there was a lot of pressure from the IMF. There was involvement from the United States through Marshall Aid. A lot of the development aid was actually given through NATO in this period. And there were attempts at the time to incorporate Turkey also toward the European Union, which was developing. This was one of Tinbergen's hopes. But when the planners resigned, it was very striking that they were given positions at international organizations. So it was really clear that the planners at the state planning organization worked sort of in service or with the interests of the international community in mind, and therefore were also looked at with suspicion. This was perhaps even more true for foreign experts like Tinbergen. There was also an ideological clash. So from the beginning, it was alleged by the more conservative political parties in Turkey that many of the planners were socialists, and this was, in fact, made the organization not neutral and above the parties, but rather part of the political process. I don't think Tinbergen succeeded in remaining above the parties, but this is what he strove for all the time. That's what his model of expertise also suggests. So despite this major resignation, in which basically all the people that Tinbergen had recruited and that worked with him on this first 5-year plan, they resigned, Tinbergen stayed on. He did voice his support for the planners and argued for all the reforms that they were in favor of. But nonetheless, he did not show his loyalty by also resigning or giving up. I think, again, the international dimension is important here. The international community did not want him to give up, or the West did not want him to give up. Instead, he started working on the second 5-year plan. This plan was even more international, more of an international project. So Bengt Hansen and Jagdish Bhagwati, a Swedish and an Indian economist, were also brought in. Nicholas Kelder had been involved earlier in the tax reform. This resulted in a 1964 Paris conference in which all the major donor countries and international organizations were present, and then another one in 1966 in Ankara. By then, the government had changed, and there was more of a direct conflict. What I found particularly interesting or fascinating was that the models that Tinbergen had implemented were now used against the West, because the government said that they were very ambitious and therefore wanted to set high growth goals, but this would have committed the West to ever higher levels of development aid, because the model showed that this could only be done because it was based on a balanced budget if more aid was being brought in. So now the government had also used to learn the models against the planners or against some of the interests that they were fighting. Yeah. So Tinbergen stayed on. He was on an international government mission. His help, as well as the financial aid, was explicitly part of a strategy that included NATO and attempted to keep Turkey away from contacts with the USSR. They followed the example of Pakistan and later also Indonesia to flirt with the USSR and said, if you don't give us enough aid, we'll ask the other ones whether they are willing to do it. At the same time, there is what one might call a kind of economic intelligence or economic espionage going on. So Tinbergen is reporting back to the Dutch government. And for example, this Peter Cornelissen that I mentioned at the beginning said that they were always looked at with some suspicion because the figures that were going around in the SPO, they would report them back, or they were accused or of reporting them back to the Western governments. So there was also mutual suspicion during this period. Tinbergen himself was also under some kind of surveillance. So I don't know whether this organization is still very famous, but he gave an interview to the magazine of Yon, a socialist organization, and that therefore he received reprimands from the Dutch government, is that he shouldn't be so left-wing and that he should represent the Dutch state and be respectable. So there was also some sort of political games on that level going on. Okay. I see that I've almost reached my time, so I don't want to spend too long on this. I want to say something about how to evaluate Tinbergen's work and then discuss matters with everyone present. So I think Tinbergen, despite the fact that he was involved for 5 or 6 years, remained relatively disconnected from Turkey. He typically visited the country for a couple of days at a time, and he did so 3-4 times a year, but even so stayed disconnected from both its language and its actual markets. Peter Cornelissen recounted the wonderful story in which they went to visit the bazaar. Tinbergen felt very uneasy and was quickly escorted back to his hotel. Also, Tinbergen was more a diplomat than a politician, so sometimes he was also simply outplayed by, also because he didn't master the language, but he also had not a very strong political instinct, so sometimes he was simply outsmarted by the politicians around him. Besides, he was on a mission from the West, so he didn't come in neutral or wanted at all, but rather was part of a political struggle that was ongoing in Turkey at the time. He himself reflected that part of the problem lay in the fact that the international order was still too much based around power politics, and that Western interests trumped the interests of the developing countries. So I think Tinbergen, on a sort of basic level, was very much interested in development economics for its own sake, but the development economic projects on which he was sent were part of the Cold War dynamics between the West and the East. So his own goal to merely focus on economic growth was always thwarted by these bigger political issues. Nonetheless, I think if you look back at his legacy in Turkey, he set up this the state planning organization or the Devlet Planlama, and which proved to be a very resilient and also became a very prestigious organization. And I think this is what I also saw in his legacy in the Netherlands, is that he was very good at institution building. And that often ensured that his legacy lived far longer than he was around, because the people were still working along and within the rules and the institutions that he set up. So in some sense, his influence is quite long-lasting in a lot of places. So let me stop there and join.
Thank you, Erwin, for this very interesting paper. Also, thank you for using the time very efficiently. Well, I have a number of remarks and questions, but I would, of course, first like to ask the audience who would like to make a remark or ask a question. If so, if you can just raise your hand like this. I'm going to, yeah, Bisay Hocam, Bisay Kurça is, okay, let me see. Bisay Hocam, you are muted. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for,
Thank you.
Thank you, Erwin Dekker. It was a very lucid and very rich account of, in such a short time, of Professor Tinbergen's contribution to planning, its role in new institution building in Turkey. You have a very good, very rich book, perhaps already printed, and I very much wish to read it soon, I hope. A very little correction. It was not Democratic People's Party, but it was Democratic Party. People's was not existent in that party. Well, I have two questions, in fact, but perhaps I should raise a couple of points before asking the questions. Two questions. One was that in Turkey that time, there was no planners. The planning was not within the interest of academic community that time. And you can imagine that during the 1950s, macro policies in Keynesian terms was still removed from the Turkish economists. We were just started to learning what macro means and what kind of fundamentals have a meaning in shaping the economic policy. So that was all of a sudden. But it was quite remarkable that the planning started with such a maturity, thanks to the critical role of Professor Tinbergen. Because his role, as I followed your interpretation, his role was exceptional because he was not an expert appointed for controlling the economic policy mechanism. In contrast to the other so-called experts coming from IMF, the World Bank, etc. So his role was historic, and he united, in fact, he made a role to unite two basic streams of 1930s and 50s. In the 50s, perhaps thanks to Adnan Menderes' economic policy of investment in dams, hydroelectric, hydroelectric investment projects, etc. Those who are responsible for these projects started to think in terms of investment criteria, which were very much on the agenda of the 1950s in other countries. Investment criteria. For what kind of criteria we are making investments? This was basic for those expert engineers during the 1950s, without knowing the exact means of investment criteria. And the other stream was coming from the 1930s. Again, the engineers of the first industrialization effort of the 1930s. Those two streams united by chance, by historical chance, just at the 1960. Thanks to Professor Tinbergen's role in introducing his concept of planning in stages and proposing a framework for planning, as well as uniting that framework within a kind of growth model, the Harrod-Domar model, in which the scarce factor is capital. So the outcome was naturally the inevitable high growth rate, what we needed. But how can we achieve the high growth rate without having a planning mechanism? So Tinbergen's proposal solved the problem, uniting, in other words, the high growth model with this planning in stages. At the base, the project level, as you said, the investment phase, you said, and then the upper level is the sectoral level in which we can watch and introduce ourselves to input-output problems, learn it. And at the top level, macroeconomics, the fundamentals. So the synthesis, this kind of synthesis, was soon achieved with the first planning, model and the first planning phase, beginning with 1962. Too early for a country which had no, say, horizon for the long-term economic decisions, the structural decisions. So that was quite an achievement. So that's the main role I attribute to Professor Tinbergen. And as you pointed out, the High Planning Council was most important because it was the main location on which politicians of responsibility met with the planners. And everybody was on equal terms, everybody, except the Prime Minister. So it was the main institution, apart from the preparation of planning, etc. But the politicians started to get used to speak in terms of planning. They learned the language of planning and started to pronounce national income, started to pronounce investment, started to pronounce savings, etc. Even capital output ratio. That was amazing. That was quite a surprise and quite an achievement for the political staff of Turkey. Right or left, they were speaking the same language in terms of fundamentals. And when they go to the election, they were maintaining keeping on speaking the same terms. In a country where the rural population steals almost 80% of the whole. So that's an interesting, that was an interesting time. Of course, there was resistance, a kind of resistance that was quite natural, because planning means a kind of rational discipline combined with the long-term outlook and policies. So that was striking. Politicians who were not believing the magic, I would say, the magic of planning, started to speak in terms of planning. That was quite an achievement in Turkish politics as well. Now, let me get to the two questions without making a counter presentation. Well, in fact, your presence and your presentation is quite extraordinary. We thank you for that. What I'm looking for is first, if you met and inquired into the Professor Tinbergen's memories on Turkey, the private memories, his observations on the Turkish population, Turkish social phenomena, as well as his observations on politicians and their behavior, etc. So if you have, in any case, any observation, any collection of his private observations, that would be welcome. And the second question is that, is he a living memory, a drop in history, or can we think of his concepts? His concepts can be renewed again, can be renewed in terms of today's paradigm shift, let's call, in which we are living, the paradigm shift after 1980. If any relevance of his concepts and models to be renewable in today's countries, let's call so-called emerging economies, because before the paradigm shift, they were termed developing economies. After the paradigm shift, they became emerging economies. So what kind of, can we have any relevance of his concepts, any recreation that we can think of, if we think of planning once again in Turkey's economy under different historical time, and in a different social relations than 60 years ago, shall we resort once again and knocked at his door? Please, Professor Tinbergen, tell us if you still have some concepts that are relevant today or not. So these were the two questions.
Thank you, Hocam, for your contribution and the questions. Erwin, would you like to say a few words or respond?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, I want to thank, first of all, Bilse, for the wonderful supplements. I agree with all of them. So indeed the hydroelectricity and the dams engineers were really important. A lot of the people were recruited from those offices into the SPO. And the only thing you briefly mentioned Keynes, and I really think that all of the planning that goes on here is supply side oriented, and so in some sense it was un-Keynesian macro. All of development economics is really based around, as you mentioned, this capital shortage and how do we overcome this capital shortage in an effort to industrialize. The other thing that I noted down when you were sort of explaining why Tinbergen was significant and what his legacy was, is that Tinbergen didn't have a major theory of economic development, right? So there are famous theories from that period called the big push, or stages of growth, or whatever you have. Tinbergen had none of that. He was very pragmatic on that theoretical level, but in the sort of methodology of planning, so with these stages, right, he really had a guidebook, which was very practical, and which he also wrote down in manuals, the design of development for the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So it was a sort of hands-on, practical engineering type knowledge, a very applied type of economics, not at all theoretically high-minded or anything of the sort, which in some sense I think contributed to its influence, because it was already practical, and it didn't, right, it was not a big idea that people had to then make their own or come to understand, but it was sort of practical tools. And the final thing that on that is that the extent to which planning disciplined politics, right? This is, I think, a recurring theme, even in the Netherlands, where he's sometimes hailed as a hero of the left. The Tinbergen's models really discipline the economists. Now, okay, then on to the two questions is that, are there private memories? Sadly, for this period, there are no private memories from Tinbergen present. I'm happy to share with all an article he writes in 1964, in which he reflects, it's called Die Probleme der moderne Türkei. So it's in German. I don't know whether that's a language that's still read, But of course, historically, that was often the language that was used as the intermediary language. But we don't have a lot of private memory. So there are some notes that he writes to the Dutch government, but of course, even these are far from private. So he does express his impression of Demirel in 1965 and 66. And so we have some reflections of that period, but not in a sort of private journal. And then whether there's renewed relevance, yeah, this question I find very interesting because the situation is, I think, so different between different countries. So in the Netherlands, I would say that we should move away from this technocratic model of economic policy making, and that we sometimes would need a little bit less reliance on the experts. So there I'm actually with some of the critique of expertise that is going around. But of course, I understand that that situation is very different from highly politicized societies in which expertise has virtually no influence over economic policy. So I think that really depends on how you think about it. And then what does Tinbergen contribute? Well, I don't think his model of planning in stages held up particularly well, but I think this institutional side of his contribution that I sought to make out, right? Where you organize it, how you organize it, where do you place it in the political system? I think all of that, his work can provide lots of lessons. And this is really where he always thought about this stuff quite well. And that's not a legacy that he's famous for, but also on an international level. He was supportive of the G77. He was aware of sort of power imbalances. So he was always thinking about how can I create institutions that are organized on a sort of basis of equality. And so when you said in the High Planning Council, right, people talk the same language. So how can we create a shared forum in which people can sort of rationally discuss matters with each other? And that is really a trick of institutional design in his legacy. So I think that might be one area where we can draw particularly a lot of inspiration still from his work.
Altı bir soru daha sormak istiyorum buna bağlantılı.
Yes, sure. Yes, of course.
Well, thank you very much for your explanation. Once again, for the relevance question, I should add up that Professor Tinbergen was an exceptional figure in terms of he was a main institution builder in combination with high level of economic theory. So this is quite a combination. Coming from econometrics of 1930s, the founder of Economic Society, and having Nobel Prize in 1970. And then in parallel with that, planning in stages, comprehensive planning. This is quite a combination, which is exceptional in today's economists. I can hardly see any economist proposing, well, having a high level of economic theory of today, but at the same time, proposing insistently on institution building for perhaps national policy proposals. Well, today we are aware that in this world of capital movements, national policy package became too small. The instruments became too inefficient. But again, a figure like Professor Tinbergen, if he ever lived today, could propose something, could have proposed a kind of combination with institution building, with the support from economic theory. Would it be realistic or not? That's the question.
Erwin, before allowing you to respond to Professor Kruch, maybe I should ask if there are any others in the group who would like to ask a question or make a contribution to this session. Any questions, remarks from the group? Okay, Erwin, maybe if you have anything to add, you can please go ahead.
Well, I mean, on this institutional awareness, let me just give an example of something that I found incredibly striking. Right. So Tinbergen is involved in thinking about economic integration, and then right, he thinks, so how can we think about this problem of developing countries during this period and the ideal of economic integration in the West at the same time. And nearly all of his contemporaries therefore favor things like the European Union as it is developing. They favor the IMF and so on. But Tinbergen is very critical of them because he thinks that they are basically institutions or organizations that seek to protect the economic self-interest of the West at the expense of the developing countries. So he starts developing models in which he starts to investigate the effects of economic integration on third countries. And what he has in mind are countries like Brazil or Turkey and how they would be affected by the creation of an internal market of its neighbors or of its main trading partners. And there I think he thinks very critically about institutional design in a way that I found fascinating. Now, to connect that to his work in Turkey, here I think, in fact, he did not think so deeply, or perhaps he did not know enough about the country to do this sufficiently. But I think part of the appeal from my perspective of the 1950s policies was that it was a much more emancipatory and equalizing economic strategy than the one pursued during the 1960s, because industrialization only exacerbated existing inequalities in the country. I think you briefly referred to 80% of the country still living in agricultural regions. There was still a lot of illiteracy. So you might seriously wonder, I think, whether industrialization in such a context does not lead to more inequality and more sort of deepening of existing social divides. And I think this is sort of what the 1970s in development economics is about often. And then, they try to incorporate what they call a social dimension, but which is essentially an inequality dimension into the planning. So there is some learning on that front. But I think in these first two plans, that factor gets hardly any attention, and it's really the growth rate only that is driving the models. And even though there's some lip service to this idea of balanced economic growth and the fact that there are interdependencies between the sectors, ultimately it's very much aimed at industrialization and some major industries that are sort of picked out as the key motors of the economy.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's factual. In fact, if I say a few words, in fact, we are living in such a world that there's a central control made by Feds. The Feds, with its interest rate policy, everybody is waiting for the next meeting of the Fed, whether the interest rates, the policy rate of the Fed would be raised or not. That's the main decision. So if this is the main decision, it makes the resource allocation all over the world with the support of the Wall Street and the City of London, naturally.
Yeah.
And with the American Treasury as well. So this is a kind of central control, invisible, but everybody sees it visible. But it still creates a loophole, for national decisions and national improvisation for new institution building to be combined with sound economic theory. Because today we still we can hardly say that when we compare with Tinbergen's times, we have a satisfactory economic theory to make sound decisions. There is a loophole even bigger than that.
Yeah.
So I think the spirit of Professor Tinbergen could create new concepts, and in this regard, with Alto, you can establish a bridge, an intellectual bridge, with Netherlands, where you live and work, and Alto in Ankara, where he lives and works. So we need a bridge, a kind of bridge, to make the spirit of Tinbergen as a contributor to keep on living.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Yes, of course. I would like to do our best. Yeah, of course. Anybody in the room who would like to ask a question or make a remark before we wrap up the session? Okay. Well, Erwin, just the final remark, maybe. So we were talking before the session started. I talked to Ayhan Çilingiroğlu during the on Sunday. Ayhan Çilingiroğlu was the person who contacted with Jan Tinbergen and Jan Koopman during their time in Turkey, and he was the first minister of trade and industry in Turkey. So he was one of the 4 or 5 first generation planners. So and then he's 92 years old, but he still clearly remembers things. And so I talked to him about your work, and he confirmed many of the things that you're saying. But he also said that Jan Tinbergen's time in Turkey was really limited. So the real person who worked hard in Turkey was Jan Koopman. So this is not to negate your story, but maybe a detail that we should underline. It was not Jan Tinbergen in the first place, but it was Jan Koopman who really got in touch with people. He also traveled around the country. He spent about 2.5 years, whereas Jan Tinbergen was in Turkey for a couple of days, not more than 3 days, during a period of a few years until 1966. So just a final remark for your work.
No. I mean, yeah. Thanks also for. I didn't make that very clear here, but this is indeed how they worked. So Tinbergen was a man of many professions during this period, and he was not there more than a couple of days at the time, during which he stayed, right, mostly in government offices, sometimes at the home of Koopman or his successor Peter Cornelissen, right, who I mentioned a few times. So sometimes, but he was not part of Turkish society, right? Albert Hirschman has called it the visiting economist syndrome. And this is important. The sad thing about Jan Koopman was that in the Netherlands, nobody could tell me anything about him. We had trouble tracking him down because his name is very generic. So you'll find many of them. Nobody really knew who he was. So intellectually, I don't think there's something there. But on a political level, I was very interested because I think this interaction I have seen more often in Tinbergen's life is that he needed an entrepreneurial figure next to him. So he needed, well, perhaps an entrepreneur is not quite, but a maker, somebody who could do the deals or could turn things into reality. And it appears that Jan Koopman was quite successful and also pragmatic, assertive in this role. yeah, but sadly, yeah, I couldn't really substantiate that part of the story more than what the sources say. And it's clear that he did the most of the negotiation and that he did the political maneuvering that brought the SPO into existence. Nonetheless, the design, I mean, by putting it next to other things of Tinbergen, it's clear that Tinbergen did devote time to setting up the design. But yeah, on the ground, it was not him.
Yeah. Okay. Any questions, remarks? Well, Erwin, thank you so much for your time. It was wonderful to talk to you. It is a significant contribution. I think your work suggests definitely that this is a period that we should really work hard. So I close this session. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we will be in touch. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks so much.